The company picnic was supposed to be a celebration. Families gathered under the bright Ohio sun, children running between picnic tables while their parents mingled over paper plates of barbecue and potato salad. I stood there in my carefully chosen sundress, watching my father Frank command attention at the management table, his booming laugh carrying across the park as he regaled his colleagues with another story about the good old days. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya, he called out, spotting me by the dessert table, come over here and meet the real workers. His emphasis on real made my stomach clench, but I forced a smile and walked over. The group of plant supervisors and floor managers looked up at me with polite interest, their faces weathered from years on the factory floor. This is my daughter, Frank announced, his chest puffed with what I mistook for pride. She's got herself a fancy college degree. Engineering, can you believe it? The men chuckled good-naturedly, but there was something in my father's tone that made me pause. Spends all day pushing papers around in some office building in Columbus. Not like Jake here. He clapped my younger brother on the shoulder with genuine warmth. Jake's learning the business from the ground up, the right way, getting his hands dirty. Jake grinned, basking in the approval that should have been familiar to me, but somehow never was. At 24, he'd been fast-tracked through the plant hierarchy, his surname opening doors that remained stubbornly closed to others. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I'd spent 4 years earning my degree in industrial engineering, Jake had walked into a supervisor position straight out of high school. Dad, I started, trying to keep my voice light. You know I actually designed the processes that improve efficiency on your production lines, right? The new assembly protocol that reduced waste by 30% last quarter? That was my project. Frank waved his hand dismissively, the gesture so casual it felt like a slap. Numbers on a computer screen, sweetheart. That's not real work. Real work is what happens on that floor every day. He turned back to his audience, effectively dismissing me. Kids these days think a college diploma makes them smarter than people who've been doing this for decades. The laughter that followed wasn't malicious, but it cut through me anyway. I felt my cheeks burn as I realized I was the punchline of his joke, the naive college graduate who thought she understood manufacturing better than the men who'd built their careers with their hands. Standing there in the dappled sunlight, surrounded by the sounds of family celebration, I felt more alone than I had in years. That night, driving the 2 hours back to my apartment in Columbus, I made a promise to myself. It was the same stretch of highway I'd driven countless times, but something felt different. The lights of the city appeared on the horizon like distant stars, and I knew that this would be the last time anyone would make me feel small for choosing education over tradition, for believing that progress came through innovation rather than stubborn adherence to the past. The Rodriguez household had always been a kingdom where tradition ruled with an iron fist, and my father Frank sat firmly on the throne. Our modest 2-story home in Riverside, Ohio, wasn't just a residence. It was headquarters for a family legacy that stretched back 3 generations. The walls were lined with photographs of Rodriguez men standing proudly beside massive industrial machinery, their faces bearing the satisfied exhaustion of honest labor. Growing up, I learned that success in our family was measured by the calluses on your hands and the oil stains on your work shirts. My father had started at Pinnacle Manufacturing as a line worker fresh out of high school, and through sheer determination and an iron work ethic, he'd climbed his way up to plant manager. It was a story he told with pride, usually while fixing something around the house or teaching Jake the proper way to change motor oil. Education is fine, he'd say whenever the subject came up, but it can't replace experience. You can't learn how to really build something from a textbook. This philosophy had shaped every major decision in our household, from which high school classes we took to what we planned to do after graduation. Jake had absorbed this wisdom like a sponge, following our father's footsteps with the devotion of a faithful apprentice. The expectation had never been explicitly stated, but it hung in the air like morning fog. Rodriguez's children worked with their hands. They understood the dignity of manufacturing, the satisfaction of creating something tangible. They didn't waste time chasing abstract concepts in ivory towers when real life was happening on the factory floor. When I announced my intention to study industrial engineering at Ohio State, the dinner table fell silent, My mother, Linda, set down her fork and looked between my father and me as if watching a tennis match. Jake, barely 16 at the time, smirked with the confidence of someone who knew he was the favored child. Engineering, Frank repeated slowly, as if testing how the word tasted. And what exactly do you plan to do with that? Improve manufacturing processes, I'd explained eagerly, naive enough to think this would bridge our worlds. Make factories more efficient, reduce waste, implement better systems. I want to help companies like Pinnacle become more competitive. The look that crossed his face wasn't anger. Exactly. It was something worse. Disappointment mixed with pity. Maya, honey, he said in the tone reserved for explaining obvious truths to small children. The people who know how to make factories efficient are the ones who work in them every day. We don't need someone with a degree to tell us how to do our jobs. That conversation had set the tone for the next 4 years. While I threw myself into my studies, learning about lean manufacturing principles, supply chain optimization, and process improvement methodologies, my achievements were met with polite disinterest at home. Dean's List, academic honors, internships at major corporations. None of it seemed to register as real accomplishment in my father's eyes. Meanwhile, Jake's every milestone was celebrated like a national holiday. His graduation from high school, his first day at Pinnacle, his promotion to line supervisor. Each event was commemorated with family dinners and phone calls to relatives. The contrast wasn't lost on me, but I told myself that eventually, when I could demonstrate the practical value of my education, things would change. The company picnic had been my attempt to finally bridge that gap, to show my father that my work had real, measurable impact on his world. Instead, I'd been reduced to comic relief, the overeducated daughter who thought she knew better than the people doing the real work. The drive home that night felt like a funeral procession for hopes I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. But sometimes the universe has a sense of irony that borders on the poetic. Sometimes the very thing that breaks your heart becomes the foundation for something stronger. As I pulled into my apartment complex that night, I had no idea that within 6 months, the dynamics of power in the Rodriguez family would shift in ways none of us could have imagined. The phone call that would change everything was still weeks away, but the seeds of transformation had already been planted in the fertile soil of my wounded pride. My apartment in Columbus felt like stepping into a different universe every time I returned from Riverside. The clean lines of modern furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the business district, the kitchen island where I spread out reports and laptops. Everything here reflected the professional woman I'd worked so hard to become. Yet somehow, a single afternoon with my family could make me feel like I was still that uncertain teenager arguing about college applications at the dinner table. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at the window, watching the city lights twinkle below. The corporate headquarters of dozens of companies stretched out before me, including the gleaming Pinnacle Tower, where I'd spent the last 2 years building a reputation as one of the most promising analysts in the operations department. My colleagues respected my insights, my supervisors trusted my recommendations, and my track record spoke for itself. In this world, Maya Rodriguez wasn't the stubborn daughter who'd chosen books over blue-collar wisdom. Here, I was simply good at what I did. The irony wasn't lost on me that my father had no idea what I actually accomplished at work. When he pictured my job, I suspected he imagined me shuffling papers and attending pointless meetings, far removed from the real business of making things. He couldn't have known that I spent my days analyzing production data from facilities just like his, identifying bottlenecks and inefficiencies that cost companies millions of dollars annually. The safety protocol I'd redesigned had prevented 3 potential accidents at plants across the Midwest. The inventory management system I'd developed had reduced carrying costs by 18% across Pinnacle's entire network. But these victories felt hollow when I couldn't share them with the people who'd shaped my understanding of work ethic and dedication. My father had taught me to take pride in excellence, to never settle for good enough, to push through obstacles until I found solutions. He just couldn't see that I was applying those exact principles in a different arena. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia, my roommate from college who'd become my closest friend in Columbus. "How was the family torture session?" she wrote, followed by a string of supportive emojis. Sophia understood the complicated dynamics of my relationship with my family better than anyone. She'd grown up in a similar situation, the first in her family to attend college, caught between two worlds that sometimes felt mutually exclusive. "Same as always," I texted back. "I'm starting to think some bridges aren't meant to be built." Her response came immediately. "Their loss. Drinks tomorrow? I have news." I agreed, grateful for the distraction. Sophia worked in marketing for a tech startup, and her news usually involved either workplace drama or dating adventures, both of which would be preferable to replaying the afternoon's humiliation in my mind. The next evening, we met at our usual spot, a wine bar in the short North District that attracted Columbus's young professional crowd. Sophia arrived with her characteristic energy, her designer blazer and perfectly styled hair, a testament to her success in the image-conscious world of marketing. But I could see excitement bubbling beneath her composed exterior. "Okay, I'm dying to know," I said as soon as we'd ordered. "What's the big news?" "I got promoted," she announced, her grin breaking through her attempt at nonchalance. "Senior account manager. Corner office. 20% raise. And here's the best part. My first major client presentation is to a board that includes two of my father's former colleagues." I raised my glass in a toast, genuinely happy for her success but also feeling a familiar pang of envy. Not for her achievement, but for the recognition that would come with it. Sophia's father had initially been skeptical of her career choice, but he'd gradually come to understand and appreciate her work. She'd managed to build that bridge I'd been struggling to construct for years. "That's incredible," I said. "How did your parents react?" "Dad actually called his friend at the company to brag about me," she laughed. "Apparently, I'm now his daughter, the marketing executive, instead of his daughter, the one with the expensive education." The contrast with my own situation was stark. While Sophia's family was beginning to see her professional identity as a source of pride, mine seemed determined to view it as an expensive hobby that distracted from real work. The thought that followed was darker. What would it take for my father to see me that... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Wait, Sophia's father saw her? "You know what the funny thing is?" I found myself saying. "I probably know more about manufacturing efficiency than most of the floor supervisors at Dad's plant. I've studied their exact processes, analyzed the production data, identified improvements that could save them hundreds of thousands of dollars, but because I learned it from textbooks instead of apprenticeship, it doesn't count." Sophia nodded sympathetically. "It's like they think knowledge is only valid if it comes with grease stains." Exactly, and the worst part is that I genuinely love what I do. I love solving complex problems, finding elegant solutions that make systems work better. I love seeing a process I've optimized actually improve people's working conditions and company performance, but none of that matters because it's not what they consider real work. "Have you ever thought about finding a way to prove it to them?" Sophia asked carefully. "I mean, not changing who you are or apologizing for your education, but maybe demonstrating the value in terms they can understand?" I'd considered it countless times, but the opportunity had never presented itself. My work at Pinnacle's corporate office was completely separate from the plant operations my father oversaw. We might as well have been working for different companies, despite the shared logo on our paychecks. "I don't know how I would even do that," I admitted. "The plant managers report up through a completely different chain of command. I'm in strategic operations, he's in production. Our worlds don't overlap." "Maybe they will someday," Sophia said with a mysterious smile. "You never know what opportunities might present themselves." Her words proved more prophetic than either of us could have imagined. The following Monday brought the kind of crisp October morning that made Columbus beautiful, the leaves just beginning to turn, and the air carrying the promise of cooler weather ahead. I arrived at the office early, as was my habit, and settled into my cubicle with a coffee and the production reports I'd been analyzing for the quarterly efficiency review. Pinnacle Manufacturing operated 8 facilities across Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, each with its own management structure but all reporting ultimately to corporate headquarters. My job was to identify patterns and opportunities across the entire network, looking for ways to standardize best practices and eliminate redundancies. It was exactly the kind of systematic thinking I'd been trained for, and I'd developed a reputation for finding solutions that others missed. I was deep in spreadsheet analysis when my supervisor, Dr. Rachel Kim, appeared at my cubicle. Rachel was everything I aspired to be professionally. Brilliant, respected, and capable of communicating complex technical concepts to executives who measured success in dollars rather than efficiency percentages. She'd been my advocate since I'd started at Pinnacle, and I suspected she saw something of her younger self in my determination to prove that academic knowledge had practical value. "Maya, do you have a few minutes?" she asked. "I'd like to discuss a new project opportunity with you." We walked to her office, a corner space with windows overlooking the city center. The walls were lined with engineering certifications and photos from manufacturing facilities around the world, visual testimony to a career spent bridging the gap between theory and practice. "I've been reviewing your work on the Q3 efficiency analysis," Rachel began, settling behind her desk. "Your recommendations for the Indiana facility resulted in a 12% improvement in throughput, and the safety modifications you suggested for Michigan have eliminated workplace incidents entirely." I felt a familiar flush of pride. These were the kinds of results that made all the late nights and detailed analysis worthwhile, even if my family would never understand their significance. "Thank you," I said. "I really believe that data-driven process improvement can transform manufacturing operations." "I agree completely, and that's why I want to discuss your next assignment." Rachel leaned forward, her expression serious. "We're implementing a major operational restructuring across 3 of our facilities. Quality issues, efficiency problems, management challenges. The works. It's a 6-month project that could make or break several careers, including mine." The weight of her words settled over me. This wasn't just another analysis project. This was the kind of high-stakes assignment that could define the trajectory of my entire career. "The facilities in question are struggling with productivity, employee morale, and quality control," she continued. "Corporate has decided that instead of bringing in expensive outside consultants, we're going to handle the restructuring internally. I need someone who understands both the technical and human elements of manufacturing operations." "Which facilities?" I asked, though something in her expression suggested I might already know the answer. Rachel smiled. "Riverside, Akron, and Youngstown. You'd be the lead operations analyst for all 3, but we'd start with Riverside, since it's the largest facility and the one with the most significant challenges." Riverside. My father's plant. The facility where Jake was quickly climbing the management ladder, where the Rodriguez name carried weight and respect. Where I was known not as Maya Rodriguez, operations analyst, but as Frank's daughter, the one with the fancy degree who thought she was too good for real work. "That's my hometown," I said quietly. "I know," Rachel replied. "I also know that your father is the plant manager there, and your brother works in the facility. I want to be completely transparent with you about the complications this could create." She paused, studying my face carefully. "Maya, this assignment would put you in a position of significant authority over operations at that facility. You'd be analyzing every aspect of their processes, identifying problems, and implementing solutions. Your recommendations would go directly to the executive team, and you'd have the authority to mandate changes that management would be required to implement." The implications were staggering. After years of being dismissed as someone who didn't understand real work, I would be walking into my father's domain with the authority to tell him how to improve his operations. The irony was so complete it almost seemed fictional. "What exactly would my role be?" I asked. "Lead operations analyst for the restructuring project. You'd report directly to me, but for all practical purposes, you'd be the final authority on operational changes at those facilities. Plant managers would implement your recommendations, department heads would answer your questions, and the success or failure of the entire project would rest on your analysis and solutions." The magnitude of the opportunity was breathtaking. This was the kind of project that could establish my reputation permanently, the chance to prove that everything I'd learned and all the expertise I'd developed had real measurable value. But it also meant walking into the lion's den, challenging the assumptions and practices of people who'd known me since childhood. "Rachel," I said slowly, "are you sure you want me for this? The family dynamics alone could create problems." She leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Maya, I've watched you work for 2 years. You have the best analytical mind in this department, and you understand manufacturing operations better than people with twice your experience. But more importantly, you're not intimidated by established practices or resistant to challenging the status quo. The Riverside facility needs someone who can look at their operations with fresh eyes, someone who won't be swayed by 'that's how we've always done it' mentality. Yes, the family connection complicates things, but it also gives you insights into the culture and operations that an outsider wouldn't have." I thought about my father's dismissive attitude toward my education, about Jake's smug confidence in his rapid advancement, about the years of feeling like an outsider in my own family because I'd chosen a different path. This assignment could finally prove that my approach had value, that the theories and methodologies I'd studied could solve real problems in the real world, but it could also destroy what remained of my relationship with my family entirely. "When would this start?" I asked. "Next month, November 1st. You'd spend the first 2 weeks at each facility conducting initial assessments, then another month developing comprehensive improvement plans. Implementation would begin in January and continue through April. 6 months. 6 months to prove that Maya Rodriguez, industrial engineer, could solve problems that the traditional manufacturing approach had failed to address. 6 months to either vindicate every choice I'd made or confirm my family's belief that I was an outsider who didn't belong in their world." "I need some time to think about it," I said. Rachel nodded. "Of course. But Maya, I want you to know that I'm recommending you for this assignment, not despite the family connection, but because I believe you're the best person for the job. Don't let anyone else's limitations define what you're capable of achieving." As I walked back to my cubicle, my mind was racing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. The professional opportunity was extraordinary, the kind of assignment that could define my entire career. But the personal implications were terrifying. I would be walking into my father's world, not as his daughter seeking approval, but as his superior, with the authority to judge and change everything he'd built. The question wasn't whether I was qualified for the assignment. I knew I was. The question was whether I was prepared for the consequences of finally proving it. That evening, I found myself in the one place that always helped me think clearly: the Ohio State University Library. Even though I'd graduated 2 years earlier, my alumni card still granted me access to the engineering section, and the familiar smell of books and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights had a calming effect that my apartment couldn't provide. I settled into a corner table with my laptop and a stack of manufacturing journals, ostensibly to research best practices for operational restructuring, but really to sort through the memories that Rachel's offer had stirred up. The truth was, the dismissive attitude toward my education hadn't started with the company picnic. It had been building for years, accumulating like sediment at the bottom of a lake until it formed an impenetrable layer between my family and me. Each small slight, each casual dismissal, each moment when my achievements were overshadowed by Jake's conventional success had added another layer to that barrier. I remembered the day I'd received my acceptance letter to Ohio State's industrial engineering program. I'd been so excited that I'd driven straight home from school, bursting through the front door with the letter clutched in my trembling hands. My mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and my father was in his recliner watching the evening news. Jake was at football practice, but I couldn't wait for him to get home to share the news. "I got in," I'd announced breathlessly. "Full academic scholarship to Ohio State Engineering." My mother had smiled and given me a hug, genuine pleasure in her eyes. "That's wonderful, Mia. Your grades finally paid off." But even her congratulations carried that subtle implication that my academic success was somehow separate from real accomplishment, as if good grades were a nice hobby rather than evidence of capability. My father's reaction had been more complex. He'd muted the television and looked at the acceptance letter, reading it carefully with the same expression he wore when reviewing technical specifications at work. "Engineering," he'd said finally. "That's a serious field. Lot of math and science." "Yes," I'd replied eagerly. "I want to specialize in manufacturing systems, process optimization, efficiency analysis, quality improvement. I could help companies like Pinnacle run better operations. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. The moment I'd mentioned helping companies run better operations, something had shifted. It wasn't anger, exactly, but a kind of protective skepticism. As if I'd just suggested that his decades of experience were somehow inadequate. Maya, he'd said carefully, the people who know how to run manufacturing operations are the people who work in them every day. College is fine for some things, but there's no substitute for experience. You can't learn how a factory really works from a textbook. I'd tried to explain that industrial engineering wasn't about replacing experience with theory, but about using systematic analysis to support and enhance practical knowledge. But I could see that my words weren't landing the way I'd intended. To my father, it sounded like I was claiming that 4 years of college could teach me more than his 25 years on the factory floor. The conversation had ended with polite encouragement, but the underlying tension had been established. My education was acceptable as long as it didn't challenge the supremacy of hands-on experience. The moment it seemed to suggest that there might be better ways to do things, it became threatening. That dynamic had intensified throughout my college years. When I'd call home excited about a project where I'd designed a more efficient assembly line layout, my father would listen politely but then redirect the conversation to Jake's latest accomplishments on the football team, or his summer job at Pinnacle. When I'd tried to explain lean manufacturing principles during holiday conversations, I'd see eyes glaze over as family members waited for me to finish so they could discuss more relatable topics. The most painful memory had occurred during my senior year. I'd been selected to present my capstone project at the Ohio Manufacturing Conference, a significant honor that had attracted attention from several major companies. The project involved redesigning the workflow for an automotive parts manufacturer, reducing production time by 15% while improving quality metrics across the board. I'd been so proud of the recognition that I'd invited my entire family to attend the presentation. My mother had genuinely wanted to come but couldn't get the day off work. Jake had a baseball game he couldn't miss. My father had initially agreed to attend, and I'd spent weeks perfecting my presentation, imagining the moment when he'd finally understand what I was trying to accomplish. I'd pictured his face when he saw me presenting to a room full of industry professionals, when he realized that the concepts I'd been trying to explain actually had practical value. The morning of the conference, he'd called to cancel. Something came up at the plant, he'd explained, his voice distracted. Critical production issue that needs my attention. You understand. I delivered my presentation to a room full of strangers, receiving enthusiastic applause and several job offers. But the one person whose approval I desperately wanted hadn't been there to see it. Later that evening, I'd learned from my mother that the critical production issue had been a minor equipment malfunction that any of his supervisors could have handled. He'd chosen not to come, and we both knew it. That night, sitting alone in my dorm room with a conference program that listed my name among the presenters, I'd finally understood something fundamental about my relationship with my family. It wasn't that they didn't love me or weren't proud of me in their own way. It was that my success existed in a category they couldn't validate without questioning the foundations of their own worldview. My father's identity was built on the belief that real knowledge came from experience, that the most valuable skills were learned through apprenticeship and practice, that college-educated professionals were fundamentally out of touch with the realities of manufacturing work. Accepting that my education had given me genuine expertise would require him to acknowledge that his own knowledge, however extensive, might be incomplete. The pattern had continued after graduation. When I'd landed my position at Pinnacle Corporate, my father's reaction had been lukewarm, at best. "Office job," he'd said with a slight shake of his head. "Well, I suppose someone has to push the papers around." When I tried to explain that my work involved analyzing and improving manufacturing processes, he'd listened with the patient tolerance reserved for children describing imaginary friends. Jake's trajectory, meanwhile, had been a source of constant celebration. His high school graduation had been treated like a major holiday, with extended family driving in from 3 states to attend the ceremony. His first day at Pinnacle had prompted a family dinner, where my father had presented him with a toolbox that had belonged to my grandfather, passing down a symbol of the Rodriguez work ethic from one generation to the next. Jake's promotion to line supervisor had been announced with the kind of fanfare typically reserved for major life events. Phone calls to relatives, a celebration dinner at the nicest restaurant in Riverside, A framed copy of his promotion letter hung in the living room next to my father's own advancement certificates. The message was clear. This was the kind of success the family understood and valued. The contrast hadn't been lost on me. Jake's conventional path through the plant hierarchy was celebrated as evidence of Rodriguez's determination and skill. My unconventional path through higher education and corporate analysis was tolerated as an interesting deviation that didn't quite count as real achievement. What made it particularly painful was that I genuinely respected what my father and Jake did. Manufacturing work required skill, dedication, and a deep understanding of complex systems. The people who kept production lines running smoothly deserved recognition and respect. I'd never seen my education as superior to their experience. I'd seen it as complementary, a different lens through which to examine the same fundamental challenges. But that nuanced perspective seemed impossible to communicate. Every attempt to bridge the gap between academic knowledge and practical experience was interpreted as an attack on the value of hands-on work. Every explanation of industrial engineering principles sounded, to their ears, like criticism of traditional manufacturing methods. Now, sitting in the library where I'd spent countless hours learning the theories and methodologies that my family couldn't see as legitimate, I was faced with an opportunity that could finally resolve this conflict. Rachel's assignment would put me in a position to demonstrate, conclusively and measurably, whether my education had practical value. The Riverside plant was struggling with exactly the kinds of problems I'd been trained to solve. If I could turn around their operations, improve their efficiency, and solve their quality issues, it would be impossible to dismiss my expertise as theoretical nonsense. But success would come at a cost that I was only beginning to understand. Walking into my father's workplace with authority over his operations would fundamentally alter our relationship. I wouldn't be the daughter seeking approval anymore. I'd be the superior making demands. Jake wouldn't be the favored son following the traditional path. He'd be a subordinate whose performance I'd be evaluating. The library was nearly empty now, most students having departed for dinner or evening activities. I closed my laptop and gathered my things, but my mind continued racing with possibilities and fears. Part of me wanted to decline the assignment, to maintain the fragile peace of our current relationship, even if it meant accepting permanent status as the family outlier. But a larger part of me, the part that had driven me through 4 years of engineering school and 2 years of corporate analysis, refused to back down from this challenge. I thought about all the small humiliations, all the dismissed achievements, all the times I'd bitten my tongue when my expertise was casually discredited. I thought about the confidence in Jake's smirk at the company picnic, the certainty that his path was inherently more valuable than mine. Most of all, I thought about my father's dismissive wave, when I'd tried to explain my actual contributions to manufacturing efficiency. "Numbers on a computer screen," he'd said. "That's not real work." Perhaps it was time to show him exactly how real those numbers could be. Driving home through the quiet Columbus streets, I made my decision. I would take the assignment. I would walk into the Riverside plant with my clipboard and my spreadsheets and my fancy education, and I would solve problems that conventional wisdom hadn't been able to address. I would prove, once and for all, that Maya Rodriguez belonged in the world of manufacturing, not despite her education, but because of it. The Rodriguez family was about to discover what their daughter had really been learning all these years, and I was about to find out whether proving them wrong would feel like victory or just another kind of loss. The call to Rachel came first thing Tuesday morning. I'd spent the entire weekend wrestling with the decision, but sitting in my apartment watching the sunrise paint the Columbus skyline in shades of gold and amber, I knew there was really only one choice I could live with. When Rachel answered her phone, I could hear the smile in her voice even before I spoke. "I'll take the assignment," I said without preamble. "I knew you would," she replied. "Maya, this is going to be challenging in ways that have nothing to do with the technical aspects of the work. Are you prepared for that?" "I think so. But Rachel, I need to ask for one thing. I want to handle the family notification myself. They need to hear about this from me, not through official channels." "Of course. Take whatever time you need. We'll make the formal announcement to plant management next week." After hanging up, I sat staring at my phone for nearly an hour before working up the courage to call home. It was early enough that my father would still be having his morning coffee before heading to the plant, and I wanted to catch him when he had time to absorb what I was about to tell him. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the slightly hurried tone of someone juggling breakfast preparations and getting ready for work. "Maya, honey, what a nice surprise. It's so early, though. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, Mom. Is Dad there?" "I have some news I want to share with both of you." "Of course, let me get him." I heard her calling my father's name, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the kitchen phone. "Maya? Your mother said you have news." His voice was cautious, the way it always was when I called unexpectedly. I suspected he'd learned to brace himself for announcements that might challenge his understanding of the world. "Dad, I wanted to let you know that I'm getting a promotion at work. A big one. I'm being assigned as lead operations analyst for a major restructuring project." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," my mother's voice chimed in from the background. "What does that mean exactly?" I took a deep breath. "It means I'll be spending the next 6 months analyzing manufacturing operations at 3 Pinnacle facilities, identifying problems, and implementing solutions to improve efficiency and quality." "Which facilities?" my father asked, though something in his tone suggested he might already be putting the pieces together. "Riverside, Akron, and Youngstown. I'll be starting with Riverside next month." The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear my father's mind processing the implications, understanding dawning like a slow sunrise. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "So you'll be, what exactly? Observing operations?" "More than that. I'll have full authority to mandate operational changes. My recommendations will go directly to the executive team, and plant management will be required to implement my solutions." Another pause, longer this time. "Maya, are you telling me that you're going to be coming into my plant to tell me how to do my job?" The hurt in his voice was unmistakable, but there was something else too, a kind of bewildered betrayal, as if I just announced my intention to invade his sanctuary. I chose my words carefully, knowing that this conversation would set the tone for everything that followed. "Dad, I'm telling you that Pinnacle Corporate has identified operational challenges at several facilities, and they've chosen me to develop solutions. This isn't about telling anyone how to do their job. It's about using data analysis and process optimization to solve problems that are hurting productivity and quality." "Problems," he repeated flatly. "What problems? My plant has been running smoothly for 15 years. We meet our targets. We maintain safety standards. We deliver quality products on schedule." This was the conversation I'd been dreading, but it was also the moment of truth. For years, I'd avoided direct challenges to my father's authority and expertise. Now I was about to tell him that his plant, his pride and joy, was underperforming by corporate standards. "Dad, I know you've worked incredibly hard to build strong operations there, but the data shows room for improvement. Quality control issues, efficiency bottlenecks, waste reduction opportunities. These aren't failures. They're just areas where systematic analysis can help optimize performance." "Systematic analysis," he repeated, and I could hear the skepticism bleeding through. "Maya, I've been running manufacturing operations since before you were born. I know every machine in that plant, every worker, every process. What makes you think that reading reports in an office building in Columbus gives you better insight than 25 years of hands-on experience?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the fundamental divide that had separated us for years, the belief that experience and education were not just different, but mutually exclusive sources of knowledge. And now, for the first time, I was in a position where I would have to prove which approach was more effective. "I don't think my education is better than your experience," I said quietly. "I think they're different tools for solving the same problems." "But Dad, the numbers don't lie. The Riverside plant's efficiency metrics are below corporate standards, and quality control issues are costing money and potentially creating safety risks." "What quality control issues?" The defensive edge in his voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "We haven't had a single safety incident in 18 months. Small defect rates that are trending upward, inconsistent product specifications, waste levels that exceed industry benchmarks. These might seem like minor issues individually, but they add up to significant operational and financial impacts." I heard him exhale slowly, the sound of a man trying to maintain composure in the face of what felt like an attack on everything he'd built. When he spoke again, his voice was strained with the effort of staying civil. Maya, I need you to understand something. That plant isn't just my workplace, it's my life's work. Every system, every protocol, every improvement has been earned through years of trial and error. The people there trust me, because I've proven myself, day after day, year after year. Now you're going to walk in with your college degree and your corporate authority and tell us we're doing things wrong? The pain in his words was like a physical blow. I'd known this conversation would be difficult, but I hadn't anticipated how much it would hurt to hear him describe my assignment as a personal attack. Yet underneath my sympathy for his position, I felt a familiar frustration building. Why couldn't he see that improving operations wasn't the same as diminishing his accomplishments? It's not about right and wrong, I tried to explain. It's about continuous improvement. The best manufacturing operations are always evolving, always looking for ways to do things better. That doesn't invalidate what you've built, it builds on it. Easy words when you're sitting in a corporate office, he replied, his control finally slipping. But when you're responsible for meeting production targets with real people doing real work, continuous improvement isn't just an academic exercise. It's my reputation, my career, and the livelihoods of 200 families. I heard my mother's voice in the background, trying to mediate. Frank, honey, Maya is just trying to do her job. Her job, he said bitterly. Her job is to second-guess mine. Dad, that's not. Maya, let me ask you something, he interrupted. Have you ever run a production line? Have you ever had to make split-second decisions when a machine breaks down in the middle of a critical order? Have you ever had to look a worker in the eye and explain why their job is being eliminated because some efficiency expert decided their position was redundant? Each question hit like an accusation, highlighting the experiential gap between us. I'd studied these scenarios in textbooks and case studies, but I'd never lived them. I'd analyzed production data and identified optimization opportunities, but I'd never been responsible for the human consequences of implementing those recommendations. No, I admitted. I haven't had those experiences. But I've studied hundreds of similar situations, and I've learned from the successes and failures of other operations. My job isn't to replace your judgment. It's to provide additional perspective that might help solve problems you're too close to see clearly. Too close to see clearly, he repeated, his voice now carrying a cold anger I'd rarely heard before. Maya, I see that plant more clearly than anyone. I know which machines are temperamental, which workers are struggling, which processes need attention. I see everything because I'm there every day, working alongside the people who depend on me to keep things running smoothly. I know you do, I said, trying to bridge the growing chasm between us. And that knowledge is invaluable. I'm not trying to diminish that or replace it. I'm trying to complement it with analytical tools that might reveal patterns or opportunities that aren't visible from day-to-day operations. But I could sense that my words weren't having the intended effect. Instead of reassurance, he seemed to hear condescension. Instead of collaboration, he heard colonization. The conversation was spiraling toward exactly the kind of conflict I'd hoped to avoid. Maya, he said finally, his voice heavy with disappointment. I taught you to work hard, to respect the people who came before you, to understand that real accomplishment comes from dedication and experience. Now you're going to use that education I supported to tell me that my life's work isn't good enough. The accusation was so fundamentally wrong, so far from my intentions, that I felt tears stinging my eyes. Dad, your work is extraordinary. The plant runs because of your leadership and expertise. I'm not trying to diminish that. I'm trying to help make it even better. Better according to whom? Some corporate executives who've never set foot on a factory floor? Some computer models that reduce human beings to data points? Better according to objective measures of efficiency, quality, and safety, I replied, my own voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Better according to standards that help companies compete in global markets and provide stable employment for their workers. Don't lecture me about providing stable employment, he snapped. I've been keeping people employed in this town for 15 years. I've fought corporate downsizing, I've protected jobs during economic downturns. I've built a team that trusts me because I've earned that trust. What have you done besides analyze spreadsheets? The question struck at my deepest insecurity. The fear that maybe my family was right, maybe my education was just theoretical knowledge without practical value. But it also ignited something else, a determination to finally prove that my work mattered, that the problems I solved and the improvements I designed had real impact on real people. I guess we're about to find out, I said quietly. The conversation ended shortly after that, with stilted pleasantries that couldn't mask the fundamental shift that had occurred. I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, challenged an authority that couldn't be questioned, without changing everything between us. That evening, Jake called. His voice carried a mixture of confusion and anger that suggested my father had already briefed him on the morning's conversation. Maya, what the hell is going on? Dad called me at work completely furious, saying you're coming to the plant as some kind of corporate inspector. I'm not an inspector, Jake. I'm an operations analyst assigned to help improve efficiency and solve quality issues. Same difference. You're coming in as Dad's boss, essentially. I'm coming in as someone with specific expertise in process optimization and industrial engineering. The goal is to help the plant perform better, not to criticize what's already been accomplished. Come on, Maya. You know how this looks, right? The daughter who was too good for the family business coming back to tell everyone they're doing things wrong. Dad is devastated. The word devastated hit me like a punch to the stomach. I'd known my father would be unhappy about the assignment, but I hadn't realized how deeply it would wound him. Yet underneath my guilt, I felt a spark of resentment. Why was his hurt more valid than mine? Why was it devastating when someone questioned his expertise, but acceptable when he dismissed mine? Jake, I never said I was too good for the family business. I chose a different path, one that happens to give me skills that could benefit the business. Why is that threatening? Because you're essentially saying that everything Dad built isn't good enough, that all his experience and knowledge need to be corrected by someone who's never actually run a plant. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that operational challenges exist at the Riverside plant, and I have tools and training that might help address them. That's not an attack on Dad. It's an opportunity to make things better. For who? For the corporate executives who want to squeeze more profit out of the plant? For the consultants who get paid to find problems whether they exist or not? I heard an echo of my father's defensiveness in Jake's words, the same assumption that improvement necessarily meant criticism, that analysis necessarily meant attack. It was frustrating to realize that both of them saw my assignment through the lens of family dynamics rather than professional necessity. For everyone, I said firmly. For the workers who deserve safe, efficient working conditions. For the customers who depend on quality products. For the company that needs competitive operations to survive in a global market. And yes, for Dad, whose reputation and career benefit when his plant performs at the highest level. Maya, you really don't get it, do you? This isn't about efficiency metrics or quality standards. This is about respect. Dad has given his entire career to that plant, and now his own daughter is going to walk in and tell him he's been doing it wrong. I'm going to walk in and do my job, I replied, finally losing patience with the assumption that professional analysis was personal attack. If Dad chooses to interpret that as disrespect, that says more about his insecurities than about my intentions. The words were out before I could stop them, harsher than I had intended, but expressing a frustration that had been building for years. Jake's sharp intake of breath told me I'd gone too far. His insecurities? Jake's voice was incredulous. Maya, Dad is the most respected manager in the company. People look up to him because he's earned it through decades of hard work and results. You're the one with insecurities, coming back to prove yourself to a family that never asked you to. You're right, I said quietly. Nobody asked me to prove myself. But maybe it's time I did anyway. The phone call ended on that note, leaving me alone in my apartment, with the growing realization that accepting Rachel's assignment had set in motion a series of consequences I couldn't control or predict. In 6 weeks, I would walk into the Riverside plant, not as Frank Rodriguez's daughter but as the corporate analyst with authority to evaluate and change his operations. The professional opportunity was extraordinary, but the personal cost was already becoming clear. The girl who had grown up seeking her father's approval was about to become the woman with the power to judge his life's work, and I was beginning to understand that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. The weeks leading up to my assignment felt like preparing for battle while simultaneously grieving a death. My father's voice on our weekly phone calls had become increasingly distant, our conversations reduced to stilted exchanges about weather and work that carefully avoided the elephant in the room. Jake had stopped calling entirely, and my mother's attempts to maintain normalcy only highlighted how fractured things had become. But while my family relationships deteriorated, my professional preparation intensified. Rachel had given me access to 3 years of operational data from the Riverside plant, and what I discovered during those late nights in my Columbus apartment was both troubling and validating. The problems I'd mentioned to my father weren't speculative concerns from corporate executives. They were documented patterns emerging from the plant's own reporting systems. Quality defect rates had increased by 12% over the past 18 months, with particular issues in the automotive sealing components that represented 40% of the plant's output. Waste levels exceeded industry benchmarks by nearly 8%, translating to hundreds of thousands of dollars in unnecessary material costs annually. Most concerning of all, efficiency metrics showed a gradual decline that suggested systemic issues were compounding over time. What made these findings particularly significant was that they contradicted the plant's own internal assessments. Monthly reports submitted to corporate consistently rated performance as, quote, meeting or exceeding targets, but the underlying data told a different story. It wasn't that my father was deliberately misrepresenting the situation, it was that the reporting systems he relied on weren't designed to capture the gradual degradation that I could see when analyzing trends over extended periods. This disconnect between perception and reality was exactly why corporate had initiated the restructuring project. Plants across the network were struggling with similar issues, and traditional management approaches weren't identifying or addressing the root causes. My assignment wasn't punishment for poor performance. It was recognition that conventional wisdom needed to be supplemented with analytical approaches that could reveal hidden patterns and opportunities. Understanding this gave me confidence in the professional necessity of my role, but it didn't ease the personal anguish of knowing that my analysis would essentially prove my father wrong about his own plant's condition. Every chart I created, every trend I identified, every recommendation I developed would serve as evidence that his assessment of plant operations had been incomplete or inaccurate. The irony was devastating. For years, I desperately wanted my father to recognize my expertise and value my contributions to manufacturing excellence. Now I was about to get that recognition in the most painful way possible, by demonstrating that his plant needed exactly the kind of systematic analysis he'd dismissed as theoretical nonsense. 2 weeks before my assignment began, I made one final attempt at reconciliation. I drove to Riverside on a Saturday morning, hoping that a face-to-face conversation in familiar surroundings might bridge the growing chasm between us. The October air was crisp and golden, reminding me of childhood weekends when my father would take Jake and me to watch high school football games or visit the county fair. I found him in the garage, as I'd expected, tinkering with the 1987 Camaro he'd been restoring for the past 5 years. His hands were black with grease, and there was a contentment in his movements that I rarely saw when he talked about work. This was his sanctuary, the place where problems had mechanical solutions and expertise was measured by the ability to make broken things whole again. "Hi, Dad," I said from the doorway, not wanting to startle him. He looked up from the engine compartment, his expression carefully neutral. "Maya, didn't expect to see you this weekend. I wanted to talk to you before I start the assignment, to see if we could find some common ground." He wiped his hands on a shop rag and leaned against the workbench, his posture suggesting he was prepared for an unpleasant conversation. "What kind of common ground?" I stepped into the garage, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and metal shavings that had defined my childhood understanding of my father's world. The kind where we remember that we're on the same side, where we both want what's best for the plant and the people who work there. "Are we on the same side, Maya? Because it feels like you're coming to prove that everything I've built is wrong." The hurt in his voice was raw and immediate, cutting through my carefully prepared talking points. This wasn't about professional disagreement anymore. It was about identity, legacy, and the fear that his life's work was about to be judged inadequate by his own daughter. Dad, improving something isn't the same as saying it's wrong. The plant runs because of your leadership and expertise. But that doesn't mean there isn't room for optimization. Optimization, he repeated, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. Maya, you keep using these corporate buzzwords like they mean something real. But at the end of the day, a plant either works or it doesn't. Products either meet specifications or they don't. Workers either trust their management or they don't. And the data shows that some of those things aren't working as well as they could be, I said gently. Quality metrics, efficiency indicators, waste reduction opportunities, these aren't abstractions. They're measures of how well the plant is serving its customers and supporting its workers. His jaw tightened at the mention of data, and I realized I'd made a tactical error. To him, my reliance on quantitative analysis represented everything he distrusted about modern corporate management: the reduction of human expertise to numerical abstractions, the belief that spreadsheets could capture the complexity of real operations. Maya, let me tell you something about data, he said, his voice taking on the pedagogical tone he'd used when teaching me to change oil or check tire pressure. Numbers tell you what happened, but they don't tell you why it happened or how to fix it. When I see a quality issue, I don't look at a chart. I go to the line worker who spotted the problem. I examine the defective part. I trace the issue back through the process until I understand what went wrong. That's exactly the kind of insight that makes your experience invaluable, I replied, trying to find a way to position analysis and intuition as complementary rather than competitive. But what if we could combine that hands-on knowledge with pattern recognition that helps predict problems before they occur? What if we could use data to identify which processes are most likely to benefit from your troubleshooting expertise? But I could see that my words weren't bridging the gap, they were widening it. Every attempt to explain the value of analytical approaches sounded to him like dismissal of experiential knowledge. Every suggestion that data could enhance decision-making felt like an attack on the validity of his instincts and judgment. Maya, you're missing the point, he said with the patience of someone explaining obvious truths to a confused child. Manufacturing isn't a computer program where you input data and get optimal solutions. It's a human enterprise where relationships, trust, and experience matter more than any algorithm. When a worker comes to me with a problem, they're not just reporting a data point. They're trusting me to understand their concern and find a solution that works for real people in real situations. The fundamental divide between us was crystallizing with painful clarity. My father saw manufacturing as essentially relational, built on human connections, and accumulated wisdom that couldn't be captured in quantitative measures. I saw it as systematically optimizable, governed by principles that could be analyzed, measured, and improved through scientific methodology. Neither perspective was entirely wrong, but they seemed increasingly incompatible. His approach prioritized the human elements that my training had taught me to control for as variables. My approach emphasized the systematic elements that his experience had taught him to distrust as oversimplifications. Dad, I'm not trying to replace human judgment with algorithms, I said, making one last attempt to find common ground. I'm trying to provide tools that help human judgment work more effectively. The goal isn't to eliminate experience and relationships. It's to support them with better information and more systematic approaches to problem solving. Better according to whom? He asked, echoing the question that had haunted our previous conversations. Maya, the plant has been profitable for 15 years. Quality issues are minimal and declining. Worker satisfaction is high. Safety records are excellent. What exactly needs to be improved, and why should I trust that corporate analysis knows better than the people who've built these results? This was the moment of truth, the point where I had to decide whether to reveal what I'd learned from my analysis of the plant's operational data. Part of me wanted to avoid the confrontation, to let my official assessment speak for itself when the time came. But a larger part recognized that honesty, however painful, was the only foundation for any future relationship with my father. Dad, the data shows patterns that the current reporting systems aren't capturing. Quality defect rates are trending upward, waste levels exceed industry benchmarks, and efficiency metrics suggest systemic issues that are getting worse over time. The change in his expression was immediate and dramatic. The careful neutrality vanished, replaced by a combination of anger, hurt, and bewilderment that was difficult to witness. "What are you talking about? Our quality reports show consistent improvement. Our efficiency targets are being met or exceeded every month." "The monthly reports are accurate for what they measure," I explained carefully. "But they're not designed to identify gradual trends or compare performance against industry standards. When you analyze the underlying data over longer periods and benchmark against best practices, different patterns emerge. So you're saying that my assessment of my own plant's performance is wrong?" His voice was barely controlled, the words coming out clipped and precise in the way that indicated he was struggling to maintain composure. "I'm saying that different analytical approaches reveal different aspects of operational performance. Your day-to-day knowledge is irreplaceable, but it might not capture trends that are only visible when you step back and look at broader patterns. Maya, I know every machine in that plant. I know every process, every worker, every potential problem. I walk those floors every day. I review every report. I meet with supervisors and operators regularly. How exactly do your spreadsheets give you better insight into my operations than 25 years of direct experience?" The question hung between us like a challenge, demanding an answer that would either validate his worldview or mine. I could feel the weight of our entire relationship balanced on this moment, the accumulated history of dismissed achievements and frustrated attempts at recognition crystallizing into a single, definitive test. Because patterns emerge over timescales and across datasets that are too large for any individual to track mentally, I said quietly. Because human perception, however experienced, is subject to cognitive biases that can prevent us from seeing gradual changes or systemic issues. Because comparative analysis against industry benchmarks reveals opportunities that aren't visible when you only look at internal performance. The silence that followed was deafening. My father stared at me as if I'd just spoken in a foreign language, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't entirely read. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow with a kind of exhausted disappointment. "So that's what you really think? That I'm too limited, too biased, too inexperienced to understand my own plant's performance? That 25 years of building something from the ground up counts for less than 6 months of reading reports in a corporate office?" "Dad, that's not what I'm saying." "It's exactly what you're saying, Maya. You're saying that everything I know, everything I've learned, everything I've built can be corrected by someone who's never run a production line, never managed a team, never been responsible for meeting targets with real people doing real work." The pain in his voice was unbearable, but so was the frustration of being constantly misunderstood. Every attempt to explain the complementary value of analytical and experiential knowledge was interpreted as an attack on the legitimacy of his expertise. Every effort to position my education as supportive rather than superior was heard as condescension. "I'm saying that different tools provide different insights," I replied, my own voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I'm saying that systematic analysis can reveal opportunities that experience alone might miss. I'm saying that the problems I've identified are real, measurable, and costly, regardless of whether they're visible from day-to-day operations. Problems that don't exist according to every metric we use to evaluate plant performance. Problems that weren't identified by any of the supervisors or operators who actually work in the facility. Problems that only became visible when some corporate analyst decided to reinterpret our data according to different standards. Problems that are costing the company money and potentially creating risks for workers," I shot back, finally losing patience with his refusal to acknowledge objective evidence. "Problems that exist whether you choose to see them or not." We stared at each other across the garage, the air thick with years of accumulated misunderstanding and hurt. This wasn't just a disagreement about analytical methodology anymore. It was a fundamental conflict between two incompatible ways of understanding knowledge, authority, and truth. My father was the first to break the silence. "Maya, I need you to understand something. That plant isn't just my job. It's my legacy. Every improvement, every achievement, every recognition has been earned through decades of dedication and hard work. The people there trust me, because I've proven myself day after day, year after year. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Now my own daughter is going to walk into my workplace and tell 200 people that their manager doesn't know what he's doing, that everything they've accomplished together isn't good enough, that some college graduate with a computer knows better than the man who's led them for 15 years. The anguish in his words was like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the human cost of my professional assignment. This wasn't just about operational efficiency or corporate restructuring. It was about dignity, respect, and the fear that his life's work was about to be publicly diminished by his own child. Dad, that's not my intention. I'm not trying to diminish what you've built or undermine your authority. I'm trying to help the plant perform at its highest potential. By proving that I've been failing at my job for years? He asked bitterly. By demonstrating that my experience and knowledge aren't sufficient to run efficient operations? By showing everyone that Frank Rodriguez needed his daughter to teach him how to do his job properly? By showing that even successful operations can be improved through systematic analysis and evidence-based recommendations, I replied, but the words sounded hollow even to me. No matter how I framed my assignment, the underlying message was clear. Corporate headquarters believed that the Riverside plant needed external intervention to solve problems that local management hadn't identified or addressed. My father turned back to the Camaro, his hands gripping the edge of the workbench with white knuckles. Maya, I want you to hear me very clearly. I've supported your education, even when I didn't understand it. I've been proud of your achievements, even when they took you away from everything I know and value. But I cannot and will not pretend to be grateful when you use that education to humiliate me in front of my own people. It doesn't have to be humiliating, I said desperately. We could work together, combine your knowledge with my analytical tools, find solutions that respect both experience and evidence. No, he said without turning around. You've made your choice. You've decided that your way is better than mine, that your education trumps my experience, that your corporate authority matters more than my relationship with my workers. So do your job, Maya. Do your analysis, write your reports, implement your recommendations. But don't expect me to pretend that this is anything other than what it is. What is it? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. He turned to face me one final time, his expression a mixture of sadness and resignation that I'd never seen before. It's my daughter choosing her career over her family. It's the moment I finally understand that the education I supported has turned you into someone who sees me as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a father to be respected. The accusation was so unfair, so far from my actual feelings, that I felt tears burning my eyes. That's not true. I love you and I respect everything you've accomplished. I just think there are ways to make it even better. Better, he repeated with a bitter laugh. Maya, at what point does better become different? At what point does improvement become replacement? You keep saying you respect what I've built, but you're about to tear it down and rebuild it, according to your specifications. I'm about to optimize it according to evidence-based best practices, I corrected, but even as I spoke, I could hear how clinical and detached my words sounded compared to his raw, emotional truth. Same thing, he said quietly. You're gonna walk into my plant and prove that Maya Rodriguez knows better than Frank Rodriguez. That college education trumps shop floor experience. That systematic analysis matters more than human relationships. He picked up a wrench from the workbench and turned back to the engine, a gesture of dismissal that was unmistakably final. I need to get back to work now. Real work, with my hands, solving actual problems that exist in the physical world. I stood there for another moment, watching him bend over the engine compartment with the focused intensity that had always characterized his approach to mechanical problems. He'd effectively ended our conversation and possibly our relationship with the implication that my work was somehow less real, less valuable, less legitimate than his. Walking back to my car, I felt a complex mixture of grief and determination that would define my approach to the assignment ahead. I was grieving the loss of any hope for my father's professional respect and personal approval. But I was also more determined than ever to prove that my education, my analytical approach, and my systematic methodology could solve problems that conventional wisdom had failed to address. In 3 weeks, I would walk into the Riverside plant, not as Frank Rodriguez's daughter seeking approval, but as Maya Rodriguez, lead operations analyst, with full authority to evaluate and improve his operations. The girl who had spent years trying to bridge two worlds was about to discover whether professional vindication could compensate for personal loss. The drive back to Columbus felt like crossing a bridge that would no longer exist behind me. Whatever happened during my assignment at the Riverside plant, my relationship with my father would never be the same. The only question now was whether proving him wrong about my capabilities would feel like victory or just another kind of defeat. As the familiar skyline of Columbus appeared on the horizon, I made a silent promise to myself. I would do my job with absolute professionalism and uncompromising excellence. I would identify every problem, develop every solution, and implement every improvement that the data demanded. I would prove once and for all that Maya Rodriguez belonged in the world of manufacturing not despite her education, but because of it. And if that meant choosing my career over my family's approval, then that was a choice I was finally prepared to make. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.